the way we live is really centered on what we value, and that itself is culturally mediated. So there's much to be learned from thinking about the diversity that LA has.
Yeah.
And drawing on some of these other cultural models that folks who are immigrants here, or who have family stories about the way things could be or the way things were, and thinking about, okay, what do we want our collective futures to look like?
Welcome, everyone. Thanks again if you've already been here. Whose is there more than one time this season? Yay, thank you for coming back. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for the effort to join us tonight. Again, my name is Joel Kizan. I'm manager of public programs here at Natural History Museum. Welcome again. And our theme this season is From Feelings to Pheromones. This season we looked at the sex life of animals. We tackled the myths and assumptions of gender in the natural world. We looked at plant cloning, and tonight we're going to look at the global population and how it's impacted the climate and how we live. So I think you're going to be in for some really great insight tonight and maybe some surprises. Who knows? Now, on behalf of NHM, it's my pleasure to introduce our host and moderator for First Fridays this season, driven by a mission to redefine where science, storytelling belongs, and a belief in the power of science to connect people and communities. I personally want to thank them for being a wonderful collaborator for our discussions. Their thoughtful and thorough preparation to ensure our talks are not only informative and relevant, but empathetic, lively, and thought-provoking. So please give a big round of applause to neuroscientist and science communicator, Dr. Yewande Pierce.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to First Fridays. So good to see you all. Thank you, Joel, for that really warm welcome, as always. And I just want to take this opportunity to really thank all of the Natural History Museum staff. They do so much hard work behind the scenes to put on this really special event. And also to you, the audience. Every month, your questions are incredible, you're open, you're thoughtful, and it's really wonderful to see how many people are engaged in science and these discussions. But without further ado, I'm really excited for this final discussion of the season. So let's dive in. So the Earth's human population has reached 8 billion. So what does that mean for our planet? Is it a catastrophe or an opportunity for new solutions? Tonight, we'll examine the connections and misunderstandings regarding population and climate change and discuss how to address these issues in terms of their societal impact, policies, and equitable solutions. So I'm really, really excited to introduce our guest for this evening. Please welcome from UCLA's Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, Dr. Aradhana Tripathi. Dr. Tripathi is an Indo-Fijian American geoscience professor who examines the climate impacts of changing greenhouse gas levels through the lens of Earth history. She's passionate about people, STEAM, justice, the oceans, and the environment, and founded the Center of Diverse Leadership and Science. Thank you, Dr. Tripathi, for joining us this evening. Okay, so this is a full room, so I think we all care about the environment, but definitely I think climate fatigue is something that can sometimes hinder efforts to address climate change, partly due to desensitization from the overwhelming data that we're fed all of the time that just suggests that it is just too late. But your approach using historical data to understand future climate trends, describing you and your lab actually as time-traveling geoscientists, which I love. Could you explain what it means to be a time-traveling geoscientist? And when you were growing up, did you see yourself taking this career path?
Thank you. And I want to thank the Natural History Museum for hosting this event, and to the sponsors and everybody who's here, as well as yourself, for this opportunity. You know, I grew up in Los Angeles, and I have to say, I really grew up in this concrete urban environment of West Hollywood and North Hollywood. And at the same time, when I was growing up, I didn't feel terribly connected to the natural world in many ways. Mm-hmm. But when I was an undergraduate at Cal State LA, I had the opportunity in an environmental geology and peoples course to go hiking for the first time. We went up into the San Gabriel Mountains, and we learned about the different ways that environment and humans interact to shape the lived experience of so many people. We actually learned about a socially induced natural disaster. And this specifically was a dam failure that had occurred, the St. Francis Dam failure. And it was interesting to me that with just a bit more grounded policy, that disaster could have been averted. And so I grew up wanting to be a Supreme Court justice to help people.
Amazing. Big dreams, love it.
Yeah, geology professor. But actually, when learning about the disaster and learning about how scientific information, when grounded in values of care, that in turn can really be intensely impactful right here in the city that I love and grew up in. I was then hooked and kind of trying to and wanting to pursue a career in geoscience. And with that being said, so what we do in my research group is, like you said, we travel through time, and specifically we look at sand, soils, ocean sediment, and we look at the chemistry of these materials and use that to reconstruct ancient environments. We look at past time periods where carbon dioxide levels were much higher, much lower than they are, and then we look at what those relationships are and then use that to validate and improve climate models that are used for forecasting the future.
That's really interesting. I love the idea that, of course, we can think about what might happen in the future, but your work actually uses, would it be AI models to predict or make models, and then you can reaffirm that with the history and see if it aligns?
Not yet AI models,
Okay.
although that could be coming in soon. But yeah, certainly our work does look at computational models and looks at their predictions and then says, hey, here are the areas where they're getting things wrong. And here's why. Here's the underlying physics and chemistry and biology. And this is how we can then improve those models.
That's awesome. And one of the things that I know you had mentioned in a previous discussion that we had was that when you finished your PhD, you're actually one of the few Pacific Islanders that graduated that year, which is somewhat mind-blowing. And since then have faced challenges in increasing diversity, which we'll talk about later in the discussion. But wanted to see how that has specifically also influenced this pathway and kind of when that importance kicked in for you.
Yeah, so it was actually also first when I was an undergraduate and then again as a graduate student. Los Angeles is a city with incredible diversity. We're a mega city. We're, you could say, a majority minority in terms of, we're majority people of color who are currently a minority in the US, but going to become a majority in the next 20 years. And so with that, Cal State LA was this incredibly diverse environment that I studied in, and we had people who were studying there who were immigrants, people who were folks who had families that had stories of being refugees. We have people from just all sorts of backgrounds that were there. And then when I went on to graduate school to do my PhD, I was actually one of the only women of color in my department, and one of the only women of color in all of STEM pursuing a PhD. In fact, the year I finished in 2002, I was one of 3 Asian Pacific Islander women in the whole of the US who received a PhD in earth science.
Oh, it was the US?
The whole of the US.
I did not realize it was the US.
Yeah. And so you could say, okay, well, what is it like to grow up in a diverse city and then to go to this university that's really diverse and then suddenly to be in this environment where culturally it's incredibly different? And so I came across a professor, Professor Angela Davis, who
just, casually.
was a professor at UC Santa Cruz. She used to be a professor at UCLA. There was a brief intermission, and then, it's a whole political history of its own. She's incredibly active in the Black campus movement and in the broader movement for civil rights and abolition in this country. But she had created at UC Santa Cruz a Women of Color research cluster. It was a place where we could be academics together, experience belonging, but also organize together and be social together. And so that space was so important for me finding community, people who believed in me, who had career trajectories that I could model, and suddenly I could see myself continuing on in academia. I didn't feel like it was something that would be very out of place. So later on in my career, as I went on to work at Cambridge University, Caltech, and then UCLA, and again experienced being the first or the only dark-skinned woman in a space, I realized just the importance of building community and how experiencing belonging can transform the life of someone. And so I worked to very actively create community then, and that's part of what I do at UCLA and here in Los Angeles. We've actually worked with the Natural History Museum on some of our work, with East LA Community College, Cal State LA, and really with institutions across the city and state to support people from diverse backgrounds, all seeing themselves in science and believing that science should be connected to them and their families.
Thank you for sharing that, and I can't wait to dig more into the work that you're doing specifically and the impact it's having, but wanted to return to the data and get a little bit geeky. So the data, a common question in climate change discourse is it too late? When actually we should be thinking more about, okay, how can we stop making it worse? So would you be able to elaborate on your methods and how they provide insights into past climate conditions to inform future climate predictions, but most importantly, climate action, where we are now and what we should be trying to do?
Yeah, so, in the group that I have, the Carbon Cycle and Climate Research Group, we look at these variants of molecules that have lots of rare isotopes in them. It turns out that not all oxygen atoms are the same, not all carbon atoms are the same. They vary a little bit in their atomic weight. And that in turn...
Just to revisit my chemistry knowledge. So an isotope is just a different version of carbon and oxygen.
Exactly.
Cool.
Yeah, exactly right. And so that means they're different versions, they weigh slightly different amounts, they have different atomic masses, but it means that they actually have different sensitivities or behaviors to different physical and chemical and biological conditions. So we measure these in my lab on these fancy pieces of equipment called mass spectrometers. And the Curiosity rover actually had a mass spectrometer on it. And in doing so, we can tell you the body temperature of a dinosaur based on looking at the chemistry of its teeth, or from looking at the chemistry of a land snail that lived, say, 500 years ago, what the temperature was locally in that environment at that time.
Wow.
I know, it's incredible. But not only that, we can go back not just millions, but billions of years into Earth history and do this same type of study. What's beautiful about it is that although climate models predict in the future it's going to warm, they differ in the amount of warming they predict. But we can use observations of the past to test those models. We can say, hey, if models suggest that Los Angeles should have been this much warmer 500 years ago or 5 million years ago, let's compare that to the data. And then let's understand, what is it about the specifics of that model that makes us realize we can trust this or we should tweak the model in a certain way. And so that's part of what we do. Now, the work is something that many of the emerging scientists that pursue it, they do because they're passionate about climate change. They want to make a difference. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, they know that that means, of course, having the very best science that we can have, proving models as much as we can. But it also means we have to communicate about the science. We have to act on it. Mm-hmm. There's a moral imperative to do that. So all of us engage with using science in service. And that means, science may be something that we all get to experience in a place like this, or when we look up at the sky at night or go on a hike and we realize, hey, there's things happening on different scales in our day-to-day of what we're looking at. And this is a source of inspiration and of wellness for us. Yeah. But it also means that we might say, hey, this scientific information that we're learning has actually relevance to policy, right? And so then that means we may then actually work to engage with different policymakers in our efforts. Some of the scientists that I know also recognize that although we use tools from Western STEM, as I might say, there are also community knowledge systems, indigenous traditional knowledge systems that are incredibly valuable for showing us that there are different ways to engage in climate action and in stewardship. So, for example, with a group of students and faculty at UCLA, we have been working with elders in the Tongva community and in the Paiute community. Now, the Gabrielino Tongva tribe, the tribe that are indigenous to the greater Los Angeles region, to Tavangar, this area. That's their place name for it. And there are several Paiute tribes that are indigenous to the Owens Valley area, where Los Angeles gets much of its water from.
Yeah.
And what we're realizing is actually there are traditional models for stewardship of waters in both of these areas that, when supported and used today, actually give us much more groundwater and surface water. They support environmental health in ways that we didn't appreciate previously. So our communities within the center and within my group and within UCLA are very active at working with different indigenous and community partners to support the use of traditional and Western STEM knowledge systems together.
Integrating the two. I love that approach. And I just wanted to uplift a couple of things. So in terms of the data, what's incredibly smart about it is you're using computational models to predict the future. The future happens, it becomes past, becomes history, and then you look at the history to see if you were correct and how much you can then trust the future, which hasn't happened, which is incredible. Just wanted to make sure that I got that straight. And then in terms of integrating both indigenous wisdom together with some of these more, as you described them, Western STEM approaches, it sounds like we can make real progress and influence policy. One of the things that I had come across was this idea that we can act globally, where you need to think about policy, and we can act locally. And so it's thinking about mitigation versus adaptation. And so the work that you're doing has a two-pronged effect, really, doesn't it? Because it's really influencing global, but also local, like you described. So I wanted to move on to something else. So before we had the discussion, we were bonding, I would say, about our 2 one-year-olds. So we both decided to have kids, but a 2021 article in The Independent suggested that having one fewer child can reduce an individual's carbon footprint. So this is something I definitely think about. I'm sure that you've thought about and many of the audience are thinking about. So the carbon footprint would be reduced by 58.6 metric tons of CO2 annually, which is significantly more than living car-free or adopting a plant-based diet. Given the rising population of 8 billion, some would argue that population growth is the problem, whereas others actually believe that we might be the solution, and it's more nuanced than that. So I would love to talk to you a little bit about the extent to which our consumption habits, in high-income countries like the US play a role, and how we can learn from diverse cultures.
Yeah, thank you for that question. This is really an issue that I've grappled with for nearly 30 years as a person who studied these issues when I was an undergraduate and, thought to myself, because of how I was initially trained, that what I needed to do, that the onus was on me and in each of us individually to reduce our footprints by, watching what we do when we shop, turning off the lights, waiting longer in life to have kids, have fewer children, consider not having children. And, as I've gone through life and have learned a lot more about history and a lot more about the kind of science and maths of it, I realized that it's actually a lot there that doesn't entirely hold water. And here's why. Right now, a person in the US, the data as of 2022, because I just checked this, a person in the US uses nearly 80 times the amount of resources in terms of our carbon footprint as, say, a person in Sierra Leone, right?
So one person in the US, energy consumption is equivalent to 80. Wow, okay.
Yeah. And, the numbers are about 20 times for Bangladesh. And so when we look at those types of numbers, what we actually start to realize is that, okay, at the same time, people in various parts of the world are not having that many kids per person. And also, how is it right that we are, in fact, grounded in these lifestyles where we're consuming so much more? And so, with that, I think we need to consider the cultural and structural legacies that we've inherited. Why is that the case? When we look back at recent history of Los Angeles, for example, we see that we had an incredible public transit system that existed for a good part of the 20th century and that was actually bought by car companies and then shut down with the explicit intention of getting people in LA to drive further and own cars, and burn fossil fuels. Yeah. And so what's happening here is we have a society that we're part of where, in fact, corporate health is not kind of placed kind of on par with human health and well-being, but is actually privileged, right? And one could question whether they should be equivalent or whether, human well-being should be privileged. But what I would say is I think we would all say that we should at least be at the same level. And we certainly see that in other industrialized countries like Germany, for example, what's happened recently is there have been subsidies given to individuals, to communities, so that their homes can become carbon neutral. There's huge investments in public transit. And we're seeing the rise within towns and cities in the US and in urban planners in other parts of the world in developing and advancing these transition towns, the 15-minute city, new models for urban living, say in some parts of the world, but in other parts of the world, this is the way it's always been.
Yeah.
Where we don't have to be so car reliant, we can be much more resilient and much more sustainable. And so I just, really want to emphasize the way we live is really centered on what we value, and that in itself is culturally mediated. So there's much to be learned from thinking about the diversity that LA has and drawing on some of these other cultural models that folks who are immigrants here or who have family stories about the way things could be or the way things were, and thinking about, okay, what do we want our collective futures to look like?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I love the title of this discussion. I feel like this is a little twist because population problem and climate change is something I think that, like you say, we're conditioned to think about, but reframing the question in this way where it's more about whether it's a policy problem or a company problem, and especially that statistic about one person living in the US to 80 people in Sierra Leone really puts it into context. And absolutely, when I first moved to LA, actually, I could not drive, didn't drive until I was 34 because I moved to LA and the infrastructure doesn't allow for anything other than, for a lot of people, just getting a car. So I think that's a really important note to make. And I appreciate you adding that nuance to the conversation.
I think with that, I want to kind of highlight a story and we would say, how do we make a difference, right? Given the issues at hand. And so I really want to kind of point to the importance of believing that we can do something and engaging in collective action to call for structural change. One of the best ways to do that is thinking about how do you vote, right? And then actually also writing to policymakers.
Yeah.
There's a set of people I want to elevate. There's a mom named Monique Uriart who lives in and works at Esperanza Community Housing, right here in Southeast LA, near Mercado Paloma, not so far away from here, like within probably a 2-minute drive, And with that, Monique immigrated here from Mexico with her family, and when her daughter Nayeli was 9 years old, and they were living in this apartment owned by Esperanza Community Housing, they realized that, there were occasionally these really bad smells coming from across the street. And at the same time, her daughter started having these asthma attacks and nosebleeds. And other kids on the same block also were getting sick. And some of their elderly relatives were also noticing when bad smells came, they were getting sick. So what they started to realize over time is they took empty milk bottles and filled it up with air, took it to labs and said, can you please test this? They realized there were things like hydrogen sulfide that were coming out of this area that was behind a fence right across from where they lived. And it turns out there were 21 oil wells right there in an area that they couldn't see. It turns out Los Angeles is one of the largest urban oil fields in the country. And many of us, in fact, live close to areas where there's oil being extracted. You might think of kind of the oil wells in the traditional Texas sense, that, or what you might see.
Baldwin Hills, we see them
Yeah,
on
Baldwin
our
Hills,
commute.
driving to Fresno. But they're actually, some of them are inside buildings and are very close to here. And so she and other families began to campaign for there not being oil wells right next to residences. And they had this campaign for nearly a decade, and there was not a huge amount of movement. She and her daughter came and spoke at an event at UCLA, and I went up to them afterwards and I said, how can we as the center and the university support you? Her mom said, we want opportunities for mentorship and research opportunities for kids from our neighborhood. I said, okay. And then she said, we also would like to have GIS training. We want to make maps using this software called GIS. We want to take our health data and we want to go to the EPA's website and see, when there's air pollution, if these things are linked. So we co-ran a class where community members talked about environmental health impacts they were having, and we talked about air pollution, and we taught them how to make maps. Look at where this goes. All right, so in 2019, we ran this course. Beginning of 2020, right before COVID, the young woman that I mentioned with these asthma attacks, she developed cancer. And is 19 years old, and her mom calls and says, this has happened. And, the sign on the fence across the street said that there were carcinogens, things that were respiratory harming agents and so forth there. Okay. And I said, Monique, Nayeli, anything we can do to be of support, you let us know. And they said, well, we want to take these maps and we want to show it to policymakers. So they organized in coalition with other families across the city, and they went to the LA City Council. They went to the LA County Board of Supervisors, and they unanimously passed a ban on oil wells in residential neighborhoods, near schools, and near hospitals across LA City and County.
That's incredible. I actually got shivers, and it's not because I'm cold. I literally got shivers from that. That's incredible.
It's a total David and Goliath story. And they also said so the ban, and then by 2025, they needed to start phasing out existing oil wells. In 2030, they needed to all be gone. Then in 2022, their organizing then resulted in the California State Assembly and Senate also passing a bill. So this is now a gift, not just to us in the city and the county, the entire state.
That is so inspiring. That is an amazing example of how these these grassroots efforts, these local efforts can then have so much impact, and the power of just, we do have agency, and if we can collaborate with these tools, really make a difference. That's incredible.
And you know what? They're actually going to, so oil and gas in California is fighting back. Last year, they utilized the referendum process, and so Senate Bill 1137 is actually going to be on the ballot this November, a referendum on it to overturn it. Oil and gas is asking for it to be overturned. You should decide for yourself whether you want this medical buffer zone around your homes and schools and hospitals, but I think it's kind of a no-brainer, right, that one. But to me, it really shows how we can make a difference, how we can call for change, by believing that there's an issue, trusting ourselves, trusting our neighbors. Just this visual of they're going around saying the air smells bad, we're getting sick, we're collecting air and milk jugs.
Listening to your health and what you're feeling, and then being able to kind of educate yourself and find out ways to actually use the science to back up something that's, intuitive and you already know. That's incredible. I love that story. Thank you. sharing that. And I think, I mean, you're clearly an advocate for systemic change through engaging in local elections and grassroots efforts as well. And just to turn the conversation back again to population and this idea of politics in population. I mean, the idea that we are the solution and this story that you've just shared is incredibly comforting, especially given the pitfalls of eugenics, racism, nativism associated with trying to control population growth. I think there are cautionary tales in history about that approach. But definitely, I think the question of the impact of having children on the planet hangs really heavily for a lot of people, and especially young people, not just in terms of sustainability, but in terms of the future of the planet and what kind of planet we're leaving for them. You've talked about the importance of inclusivity and equitable solutions, and you've touched on it a little bit. Is there any data that you're working on right now that you feel could really impact sort of how we tackle that problem in the future?
I truly believe in the importance of us kind of being in community together and organizing, calling for change. We see when we look at the history of social movements for civil rights, and I would argue that climate change, it impacts everyone, but the burdens disproportionately fall
100%, yeah.
Yeah, on communities of color, on frontline communities, and people from the global south. I think that we're at a time where when we look at the data, there's evidence that by 2050, there will be something like more than 1 billion people, 1.2 billion people impacted by climate change to the point that they will need to engage in migration, right? So imagine, like we're right now, there's all this about immigration. What's it going to be like when our children are about 30 years old, 25 years old, right? And what are the things that we're going to be seeing at play? So to me, we have to know that climate change is occurring, but the data show that we can definitely make a difference. And that difference can come from things like working with some of the cultural solutions that we have that support stewardship. Things like supporting the restoration of native plants, working with kind of, water resilient strains of crops, supporting marine protected areas and indigenous land management has this huge, huge impact on carbon drawdown. We also have to realize that, we need to start planning for heat resiliency in different spaces. And at the same time, we need to move away from these kind of, I would argue they're these kind of racist tropes with deeply colonial roots where we talk about how the issues actually lie somewhere else. Yeah. And instead, we have to really see that the roots of the solutions lie right here in the US, and particularly in diverse cities and states like California, right? Because if we can't lead and invest and do these things here, support stewardship of diverse communities here, how can we expect there to be kind of solutions developed and implemented elsewhere where there's far more political division and far fewer resources, right? And the stakes are high. Yeah. The stakes are high everywhere, but it is our ways of life here locally. We can't take those things for granted. When we look at the record of climate change in the past, what we see is that there are times when we have highly stratified societies, be it right here in the Americas, in Turtle Island, in China, different parts of Africa. When we have these highly stratified societies, climate change, environmental disruption is an amplifier of existing problems, right? And the key then to kind of navigating these issues is really looking at what led to resilience, how did people adapt, how were they resilient, and really drawing on those knowledges. And I have to say, a lot of those knowledges are here in immigrant communities and the stories that exist in communities around the world. And so although I'm a physical scientist by training, I truly believe that the solutions for these wicked problems, these tough problems, are in fact social ones.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we talk about climate justice, which is really what we're talking about, you have a recent paper centering equity in the nation's weather, water, and climate services. And it really highlights how structural discrimination, including racism, which you've touched on, affects people's lives and health with significant impacts on their access to essential services and environmental knowledge. And I think what this really highlights is it is about collaboration and working together, but the people who are being more disproportionately impacted are almost forced to come up with these solutions and to have that wisdom. And you collaborate with Indigenous communities and have seen these impacts. And so I guess the question about diversity and inclusivity and inviting more people to the table really is about rebuilding a table and utilizing that wisdom. And I know that you do incredible work with the youth and considering the future, and you're so committed to education at the Center for Diverse Leadership that I wonder how much of this inspires them to keep going, because there's still a long way to go. And like, what do you say to them to get them to stay invested in this work?
So, there was a beautiful thing that a young woman from Compton, Brittany Miles, who I met when she was a freshman, she took an oceanography class with one of my colleagues, and I gave a guest lecture. He was getting married, and I gave one. It's one of my favorite lectures to give because it's so different. It's on oceans on other planets. And I talk about ancient oceans and the evidence for current oceans on different planets. And she came up to me afterwards and she said, I'm so interested in astronomy and planetary science. Is this really something that, one can have a career and do research in? And I said, yes. And so we maintained a relationship. She went to UC Santa Cruz to do her PhD there.
Incredible.
She built a program, Education and Empowerment in the Earth Sciences, when she was an undergrad here, where we worked with her old school teachers in Watts and in Compton. And that program still runs in different ways to this day. And Brittany is now applying for faculty positions and hoping to come back to this area. But what I'm really struck by is something that she said to me. I messaged her and I said, Brittany, I want you to know you give me hope. When I see the impact that you're having, and I see that you've gone and done your PhD, where you've come from, what you're doing, she messaged me back and she said, Aradhna, you give me hope. And I thought, that reverence makes me appreciate that although there are those days where I'm like, there's not many people around who look like us in these spaces. Yeah. What are we doing? We could be going in other directions. This is perhaps where we need to be for the next generation. Another mentee of mine, Sam, from the south side of Chicago, he's like, I was a high school teacher. I'm debating working with youth from my community that are very much at risk. I'm debating doing my PhD. I'd be the only Black scholar in my department, this year. What should I do? I feel like I'm being pulled in different directions. And I said, Sam, I can understand why you feel that way. And, it is very much like that in a lot of ways, but also you have this opportunity, perhaps this is part of your gift at this time. Perhaps you have the opportunity to be that bridge so it's not going to be so hard for the next generation. And perhaps whilst you do your PhD in science, you also have the chance to bring youth in. You're going to make it so that the next young person who comes through here with their curiosity and passions recognizes this is something that's there for them. I think the last thing I want to say, because I really focus on young people for lots of reasons, something I read on Twitter. It's a young Latina woman, first generation college student, was going to community college. She said, when I was applying for college, my parents, they didn't know how to fill out the forms, the financial aid form, the applications, and I didn't have anybody who could help me. So that's what it is. She said, but now I realize I can help my cousins because I've done this, and I can help my kids one day. And you know what that means? My ceiling is their floor, right? I'm reaching for the stars, but where I get to, that's where they're going to get to start from if I'm there to work with them. And honestly, My family, we have come from a history of forced migration, forced labor with ancestry from India. My mom grew up in a sugarcane farm in Fiji when it was still a colony. And, now we're here. I am certainly the products of my ancestors' dreams and beyond their wildest dreams. And I can't imagine what our kids will have.
Yeah.
But I only hope, by us reaching and dreaming and exercising environmental imagination and many other things, we can be those role models and they can outshine us, right? And they're going to be part of this pathways to sustainability. And I feel that way about, all 8 billion people and where the next generation can take us.
Absolutely. That is incredibly uplifting. And I mean, thank you so much for sharing your thoughtful insights. And I think the take home from this is really that inclusion is power, data is power, and also integrating wisdom from other cultures, more diverse cultures, is really the way for us to be able to move forward in this way. Thank you so much. I know that the audience have questions, so I'm going to turn it to them. If you raise your hand, a staff member will come over and hand you the mic, and then you can ask a question.
Coincidentally, when I was driving here, I was listening to KCRW, excuse me, and they were doing a program about hidden oil wells all over the country where people don't even know that they're near oil wells. An oil well could be something as simple as a pipe coming up next to a fire hydrant. So in your particular instance, it was very obvious that there were oil wells. How do you deal? They were talking about something like hundreds of thousands that they know of, and probably 1.5 million that they don't know of. How do we remediate something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, that is a wonderful question. Thank you for sharing that. The point that was made was that there are literally hundreds and thousands of oil wells across this country, and there's some that we know about, and there are many that we don't know about, because there's not a requirement to post that these are things in one's neighborhood.
That's crazy there isn't a requirement.
That's right. And at the same time, I will say that there are opportunities to write to your senator's office, your legislative representative's office, and say, we need transparency onto these things, right? We should know when there's an oil well in our neighborhood. Other people should know when there are oil wells in their neighborhoods. And there should be funds made available to subsidize capping these, just like there have been funds made available to subsidize those industries, right? For many, many generations. So let's make sure actually we're subsidizing a just green transition. That's what our taxpayer money should be going for. And so we need to call for that change. Youth activists are doing this. Families that are personally impacted, that know they're being impacted, are doing this. But many of us don't know that the health issues we've been dealing with in LA, in fact, a lot of those do have environmental health as contributing factors. For that reason, when I'm asked to serve as an expert and testify to state legislative and Senate committees or the federal side of things, I look at the evidence and I take my own time to do that, because I think it's incredibly important to do. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up.
That was a great question. Thank you. Another question at the back on the left.
Hi. A little too close.
Okay.
So, as I was listening to your commentary, and especially about climate justice, a lot of the onus still seems on future generations or our current generations. And yet, when we think about consumption patterns, as much as the current young population may, shorten our use of demand and think about how to be more conscious of consumption, in fact, it's really the generations prior that are aging into their older years and thinking about their consumption patterns are not actually changing. And so when we think about climate justice, how do we transform that narrative to really make it salient that majority of the climate issues came from the generations prior, and the current generation, that if you think about the Senate, the median age is about 65. This is the current population that has contributed to the most climate damage. So when we think of this, how do we transform the narrative of the future is what's going to change this, but it's the current people, the current generations, where we still need to plan for their consumption patterns as they age into their 80s and 90s and transform that narrative so that it's so not placed on current and future generations, but now?
It's a really, really important point. Thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, that point of, the fact is that we've had generations of carbon emissions associated with lifestyles that are inherently high resource utilizing. You're right. This is not something that we can kick off to 10 years from now, 20 or 50 years from now. In fact, we have an onus on us now to act. I completely agree with you. And there are discussions that happen in the climate justice space around about intergenerational justice and about the fact that younger generations are calling for change. They are aware of the fierce urgency of acting now, to paraphrase Reverend Luther King Jr., about the importance of acting on issues now and feeling that urgency. And so with that, I, again, would really encourage people to, particularly those who are adults, who are from higher resource families, to make a point of getting very engaged with the political process. There's another Senate Bill 1497, that's being considered in California. It's called the Climate Superfund Bill, and what it does is it says, it's an example of structural change, and we're calling with that bill, our state would be calling for the top oil and gas, the top carbon emitters from oil, gas, and coal to pay for the last 20 years of climate damages and the next 25 years of climate damages in the state, right? And they'd say, instead of all of us paying for it as we have been, and the younger generations paying for the next 25 years, instead this fund would be established, and that would be used to call for change. There's other pieces of legislation that are calling for a greening of transport systems, a greening of industry, reductions in emissions, and so forth. And so, I have to say that folks in Sacramento, folks in DC respond to when one emails them, one calls them, and so forth. And so I'd really encourage people to do that, because not doing so, especially knowing that this is an issue, is an example of willful blindness. It's essentially saying to your kids, your grandkids, and future generations,
You'll deal with that. Well, that's a really great question, because it's like pouring water into a bucket with a hole, and it has to be both. Yes, there's hope in the future with these solutions, but then, of course, we have to change our ways, and influencing policy seems to be the most effective way of doing that.
Well, also with that example of, our ceiling being their floor, if we've done nothing, the status quo persists for another generation and another generation, right? Like my mom's generation wasn't aware of these things. Her parents, many of them were not aware of these things, but certainly my generation is, and the younger generations are very conscious of it. So now that we're all share this knowledge, we have a responsibility to call for change, call for systemic change, right? And young people have been kind of voices calling for change throughout time. Their leadership in the environmental space, I think, is key. Their boldness, their sense of fierce urgency, it's what we need.
Yeah, all the way up intergenerationally.
But I would say this is a case for the elders to be heeding the younger ones.
I think that's the point.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have another question here on the right.
Sorry. I have 2 points to sort of dovetail into a question. So back in the 80s, right, China's per capita income was lower than that of Burkina Faso. And so over the last 40 years, it's been an incredible feat of lifting 1 billion people out of poverty, right? And that sort of was what I was thinking of when you were talking about the ceiling of our forebears being our floor, right? But the other point is that so much of the consumption that we have is made possible by the poverty of people in places like Southeast Asia, where my family is from, where we put things in the recycling bin and we don't think about it again. But most of our recycling gets shipped over to Southeast Asia, where our mixed recycling that we don't sort, they sort, and the stuff that can't be recycled just goes to pollute their streams. Our e-waste pollutes their streams. And so in terms of what you've been speaking of, a lot of it is great, but it's very focused on what is here. Like just this, the climate fund of like, the next 25 years of what's going on in our state, right? But what is it that we owe from a global perspective to the global south in terms of how people can be lifted out of poverty and improve their standard of living while still like being aware of how it is that they need to develop in ways that are sustainable and are not living in a lifestyle that facilitates our overconsumption.
Yeah, I think that example you gave of China is a really strong one, because many of us have heard about how China has been investing in many of the, for example, solar technologies that were developed here in the States and in Europe, for example, and been very heavily investing in it. And now, that's a very large part of their kind of energy infrastructure. We need to see similar types of infrastructure being developed here. We need to ensure that here in the US, we're developing the same types of infrastructures for many things, for the processing of plastics, whilst also reducing the usage of plastics and not shipping these things to other places. And I'd also say that in the US, we have such an incredible system of STEM training, arts, communication, to make kind of these, to connect these issues with the diversity of perspectives. We really kind of embrace some of these things as our core values and support the development and utilization of multiple cultural methods for, resilience and for sustainability. We model that, right? We can export it, we model it, we can learn from what's being done elsewhere also. I think that combination of factors then is what will actually support others wanting to kind of model perhaps what we're doing here, and companies potentially utilizing approaches that we're using here at home. For me, what I see is that we don't tend to see that we have systems in place from a corporate perspective that have any incentive to do anything other than what they've been doing, right? Mm-hmm. We're very heavily dependent on utilizing fossil fuels. Plastics, a lot of these are generated also from hydrocarbons, with that example that you've given. And I also want to kind of highlight that often when we talk about development in other countries, often what that means is opening up of markets to kind of industries that maybe have corporate offices that are based here, with the idea of kind of growing economies, but not necessarily in ways that are aligned with internal cultural values. So I'd say that, the UN has these sustainable development goals that there's a lot of discussion about how can we ensure that development is truly being done in ways that are sustainable and healthy, that honor cultural diversity and cultural sovereignty, and don't involve us superimposing ways of life and models that are based on colonial histories that have been very extractive and very unsustainable, and just exporting that elsewhere. That's not an ideal model. Mm-hmm. I found it really inspiring. Like this past Saturday, I was at a workshop being run by a group of environmental scientists, environmental historians, and community-based organizations looking at Southeast Asia and ways of supporting indigenous ways of knowing and strengthening internal governments to do science-informed work. But this is science in the broadest sense that includes community, indigenous knowledge systems, that takes into account the rich historical record of what's happened during colonialism and what could otherwise be done, and recognizes things like there may be ways of growing rice that are much less carbon intensive and much less water intensive, that are things that indigenous peoples to those areas know about. So I just, it's a complicated question that you've asked, but I hope that what I've done is I've elevated the importance of really thinking about multiple cultural framings for how we approach that, and really sustainable development aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals and ones that support indigenous knowledges as being part of the solution. You use this wonderful example of, how there's work that we and others are doing to bring voices to the table, diverse voices to the table. But, I know in a previous conversation we also talked about the importance of rethinking what those tables actually are. Yeah. And perhaps through things like, there are these models called community climate assemblies that are being utilized in Europe and Africa, in the Maldives and places. We can actually center communities on anywhere from local to national scales, taking informed decisions about climate, environmental, and other policies, and then engaging in their own planning and using that to inform policy.
Yeah, and I think that point about just non-dominant culture models, just because it's the way doesn't mean it's the right way to be doing things. It's just the way that dominates.
It's fascinating to think about, but, I would have never thought this was quite possible to imagine challenging the traditional dominant cultural models that have existed for, 200 years. But what happened during COVID, there was a huge amount that was horrible there. And we also saw that there were, vaccines that were developed by immigrants. Helped save many people. We saw that there were models for mutual aid.
That was
where
a big one.
Community models for mutual aid were really critical for, people, families, communities getting by, and for cities and societies staying stable as opposed to being destabilized. And we also saw governments at a range of scales, from local to nation-state scale, implement, living wages, sending out subsidies or grants to people, so that way they had those funds to live off of. And that was implemented in many different cultural contexts. But when we think about what that was grounded in, it was grounded in care.
Yeah.
It was grounded in a willingness to recognize that, what's at stake, human lives, and massive societal upheaval. And so we have to challenge the status quo and really exercise imagination and be grounded in that value of care. And so I'm confident if we kind of take similar approaches and call for systemic change in similar ways with respect to climate, we can, with respect to population growth and resource utilization, we can do that.
Thank you so much, Aradhna. This has been such an incredible conversation. Your insights and your perspectives are so valuable and hopeful, and the questions that were asked this evening were incredible. I think we do not have time for any more questions.
That was our last question.
That's the last question. It was a good one, though. Thank you. Now let's give another round of applause to our incredible guest, Dr. Tripathi.